Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So the other day I posted a video talking about the very important topic of the lynching of Black Americans by white mobs in this country in the 19th and 20th centuries. So I wanted to make another video going into the origin of the word lynching and talking about the definition and statistics. If you've ever been driving down the highway in Virginia and you've seen Lynchburg, that is the Lynch family, and it is one of those family members, Charles Lynch, where we get the word lynching from. Charles Lynch was a slave owner in Virginia, and during the American Revolution, he created his own local militia. And what they would do is they would go out and look for British loyalists or Tories that were still loyal to the British king, and they would attack, assault, and punish these individuals, most often by tying them to a tree and having them whipped. So this was basically mob violence. There was no jury, no judge, no trial, no law. This was just Charles Lynch and his gang going out and finding these loyalists and violently assaulting them, sometimes even hanging them. So word started to spread about Charles Lynch and his method of treating loyalists, and people started saying things like lynch law and calling him Judge Lynch. So the word lynching did not originally begin as a term to describe racist violence. It began in the context of the American Revolution. Now, fast forward to the 1800s. When slavery ended in the 1860s, white Americans started terrorizing and murdering Black Americans to show them that even though they were no longer enslaved, they would never really be true Americans. They could never feel safe and comfortable in this country. And as these illegal mob killings of Black Americans spread, people started resurrecting that word lynch law and Judge Lynch, and eventually that got shortened to lynchings. So when we use this word lynching, what we are describing is racial terrorism. And if we look at the statistics, that is exactly what we see. From 1865 to 1965, 6,500 to 10,000 Black Americans were lynched. And even though other racial groups were targeted and killed, such as Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, Italian immigrants, Chinese immigrants, even though these individuals were also lynched, if we look at the numbers, 72% of all recorded lynchings were Black Americans, even though they only represented 12% of the U.S. population. So this was racial terrorism targeted against Black Americans. 72% of all lynchings were targeted at the Black community. In places like Georgia, 95% of all recorded lynchings were against Black Americans. These numbers are really important, and it's important to be accurate when we're talking about lynching, because we can still see people making a false both sides equivalency. For example, in 2019, Republican Colorado State Representative Lori Sain made this incorrect statement. She said, "We have come a long way since the Reconstruction days, since whites and blacks alike were in nearly equal numbers lynched for the crime of being Republican." That is absolutely incorrect. White Americans and Black Americans were in no way, shape, or form lynched at equal levels. Lynching was racial terrorism directed against the Black community by white Americans. So this word is very specific, and it's important to have an accurate understanding of what it means. It's also important to recognize that lynching was a constant feature across American history for over 100 years. From 1883 to 1922, there were no less than 50 lynchings of Black Americans every year. In the 1890s, every single year of that decade, there was over 100 lynchings of Black Americans, with the worst year being 1892 that saw 161 killings. It took until 1936 for the lynching of Black Americans to get under 10 a year. And this is probably the most important piece of data connected to lynchings. 99% of the lynchers were never charged with a crime. So this was killing without consequence. This was American terrorism. This is why it infuriates me when I hear the word lynching being used in a metaphorical context or an analogy. People talking about political lynchings, such as Donald Trump comparing his impeachment to a lynching. And Joe Biden has done the same thing. He's also used words like political lynching. As we've seen, lynching is a word with a very specific meaning. It is racial terrorism that was directed against the black community by white Americans. And it's something that is not talked about enough, and we need to talk about more.